Now we are going to discuss the absorption of nutrients. When we talk about the absorption of nutrients, you need to understand what do we mean by the term absorption. Well, I have written the definition for you all. Absorption is a process by which nutrients pass from the alimentary canal into the blood and lymph through its mucous membrane, right? So this is a process by which nutrients they pass from the alimentary canal into the blood and lymph through its mucous membrane. So mainly the process of absorption, if we talk about the 90% absorption of the nutrients, it takes place in the small intestine. So 90% of absorption, it takes place in the small intestine, right? And I hope you remember that small intestine has these three regions, that is the duodenum, jejunum and ileum. So 90% of absorption of the nutrients takes place in this region, right, in the small intestine. And 10% of the absorption of nutrients, it takes place where? It takes place in the stomach and the large intestine. So 90% in the small intestine and 10% in the large intestine and the stomach, right. So what are the nutrients that are to be absorbed? They are amino acids, monosaccharides, fatty acids, glycerol, salts, vitamins and water. These are the nutrients that are absorbed. Now we will be basically discussing about the absorption of monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids and glycerol, water, salts, electrolytes, water soluble vitamins and the absorption of alcohol, right. So first of all, if you look at this diagram, you can actually make out, if we talk about the stomach, the absorption of water, alcohol, some monosaccharides, some drugs and some salts takes place in the stomach. So you can also make out over here, if you talk about the absorption of monosaccharides, I mean to say about glucose, galactose, fructose, right. So these monosaccharides, they are actually absorbed where? You can see in the stomach, and most of the monosaccharides, they are absorbed in the jejunum part of the small intestine, right. So some monosaccharides, they are absorbed in the stomach, while most of the monosaccharides, they are absorbed in the jejunum, right. Then the absorption of galactose is faster as compared to glucose, just a difference of a few seconds you can say. So these monosaccharides, they are absorbed in stomach to some extent and mainly in the jejunum part of the small intestine. Moving on to the absorption of amino acids, so look at this diagram again. When we talk about amino acids, these amino acids, they are absorbed in the duodenum part of the small intestine. So most of the amino acids, they are absorbed in the duodenum part of the small intestine, but jejunum part also absorbs some of the other amino acids that are remaining. So as a whole, again the small intestine is participating in the absorption of amino acids, the duodenum part and the jejunum part, right. Then moving on to the absorption of fatty acids and glycerol. When we talk about fatty acids and glycerol, you need to remember that fatty acids and glycerol, they are insoluble in water. When I mean to say that if they are insoluble in water, means they need to make some structures that actually are easy, right, which can be absorbed. So if you talk about fatty acids and glycerols, just look at this diagram again. Here fatty acids and glycerol, they are absorbed in what? The jejunum part of the small intestine, right. You can see fatty acids and glycerol, they are absorbed in the jejunum part of the small intestine. Now when we talk about their absorption, as they are water insoluble, there need to be some structures, by which it's easy that they are absorbed, right. So we have the formation of micelles. Now micelles are the structure that are helping these fatty acids and glycerol to be absorbed. After these micelles is what? It is an aggregation of these molecules, right. So the aggregation of the molecules, they form micelles, and after this micelles we have chylomicrons. Now these micelles actually are converted into very small fat droplets, which we call as chylomicrons, that are absorbed in the jejunum part of the small intestine, right. So for the absorption of this water insoluble molecules, they need to be converted into these structures, these aggregates that we call as micelles, and then these micelles are converted into very small fat droplets that we call as chylomicrons. This is how, in the form of these chylomicrons, the fatty acids and glycerol, they are absorbed in the jejunum part of the small intestine. Then absorption of water, salt, electrolytes, water soluble vitamins and alcohol. As you can see in this image again, if we talk about the absorption of water, alcohol, some drugs, some salts, it takes place in the stomach. It takes place in the stomach, plus the absorption of you can say water, it also takes place in the large intestine. So, to more extent this is absorbed in the large intestine and the stomach, right. Then if you look at iron, calcium, it is absorbed where? In the duodenum region, right. Then the absorption of vitamins also primarily takes place here in the small intestine part, the jejunum part, as you can see, right. And in the ileum there is reabsorption of vitamin B12. Now, vitamin B12 is reabsorbed in the presence of what? That is Cassell's intrinsic factor. It is Cassell's intrinsic factor. Now, this Cassell's intrinsic factor, which you can also write as IF, this intrinsic factor is important for the reabsorption of vitamin B12 that takes place in the ileum part of the small intestine, in the ileum region of the small intestine, right. Then in the large intestine there is absorption of water, some minerals, largely it's sodium chloride, some drugs, vitamins, right, produced by bacteria. So, in the large intestine mainly these are absorbed. So, you can make out, if you talk about alcohol, then alcohol is primarily absorbed in the stomach. If you talk about vitamins, you can see that vitamins are absorbed in the jejunum part and some vitamins are there also absorbed in the large intestine. If you talk about vitamin B12, that is absorbed in ileum, but for its reabsorption, one important factor that is needed, it is what? It is Cassell's intrinsic factor. So, this is an overview of how the absorption of nutrients takes place, right. You can actually remember this diagram for an easy understanding, so that you have a fair idea of the absorption of nutrients in the stomach, in the duodenum, jejunum, ileum and the large intestine. So, just remember what is absorption, the process by which nutrients they pass from the alimentary canal into the blood and lymph through its mucous membrane. When we talk about lymph, means we are talking about the lymphatic capillary, which we also call as lacteal. Lymph, from where the nutrients they are entering into the lymph, they are entering through the lymphatic capillary, which we also call as lacteal. And when we talk about the absorption, means we are talking about the absorption of monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids and glycerol, absorption of water, salts, water soluble vitamins and alcohol. And where does this take place? You can just keep this diagram in mind, so that you can explain how it is taking place and where the absorption of different nutrients is taking place.